All right, John Doyle, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to be speaking to you. You and I spent a good amount of time together at the OGC conference. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Likewise, I'm starting to recognize your voice a little bit more. I think that we had an interesting conversation on the way over there, didn't we?
Oh, 100%. We had several. Yeah, I was the guy who picked you
Okay.
up in the car, by the way.
Yeah, because there's so many AVIs that I'm like trying to match to names and voices and everything in the aftermath from the conference, and so I thought that you were actually a different Twitter account, and now I'm hearing this and I'm recalling my my experience in the shuttle over with you. Yeah, nothing but good times.
Well, I'll put it this way: it would not be the first time. There are multiple people who I have met, knew as separate individuals on Twitter, and then did not realize it was the same person. Like probably the most prominent one to hand is Andrew Isker. I knew that guy. I was like, I like that guy. Didn't know he was on Twitter, and then set up a voice call with 8th Century Wood Chipper, and then he hops on the line, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I know who you are. So many such cases, right?
Real, yeah.
So anyway, man, obviously you and I talked a little bit about your background on the way up to the conference, but how did you get into this? How did you get to be a young conservative voice on the internet?
Right. Yeah. I wish that it were a more interesting story than it is. I just sort of bought a bunch of equipment and started making videos. At the time, it was the bedroom of my childhood home, and I was just making YouTube content because I'd been watching. I say full time, just because it became a more day-to-day thing. Probably by the time I was about 13 or 14. But I think I've always been kind of politically aware, just because of the conversations I would have with my dad about very Obama era topics, welfare, Second Amendments. Well, I guess the Second Amendment still, but no one really talks about welfare the way that they used to, even just 15 years ago. But things like that. So it was always kind of in the back of my mind. But, you're watching your Daily Wires and your Steven Crowders and, your Dave Rubins and people like that. And you're not really satiated by the conversation that's being had. And so I thought perhaps neurotically that I could throw my hat in the ring and change the conversation in a way that would be more positive. And to the extent that I could do that as a sole proprietor, I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to do. And I mean, just as the conversation is shifting sort of at a macro level, I think that that's been very positive likewise, because, as the country declines, people's anxieties are going to give them permission to entertain ideas that otherwise would have been considered too taboo or just too esoteric or what have you. But now people are more desperate for answers, I think. And thankfully, there's been a supply of some more mainstream commentators who are willing to provide to them answers that would have gotten you fired, even just 20 years ago. And so I'm happy for whatever role I've been able to play in that.
And I think that's one of the interesting things. It's actually something that you and I spoke about. This was the subject of your speech at the conference, which is the fact that any young people on the right more generally who are worth a damn, right? Who are actually interesting, who have ideas. They're not going through the same kind of legacy institutions that, are ostensibly designed to pick those people out, right? I know there are some of our guys at, a place like Heritage, but not as many as you'd think. And so you spoke about the difference between kind of people on the more radical side of things and people in kind of legacy Republican institutions. What do you think that difference is? And how do you think that sort of projects into the future?
They're just fundamentally unserious people. The way that I sort of view college actually is perfectly compatible with how I now view the types of people staffing these institutions. Largely, you do have a minority of very intelligent, capable guys who just, by the grace of God, ended up in these places or what have you. But I always thought that college was kind of interesting as a mass institution, sort of the high school to college pipeline, because it's like you've got kids who have no interest in learning about these things, but they think that this is what they have to do. And so they're like, okay, well, I enjoyed my chemistry class, I guess, when I was in high school. And so I'll go get a 4-year degree in like microbiology, or not microbiology, like I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm a political autist, but something like that. And it's sort of like the same thing that you see with kids who are now becoming more involved in politics at a professional level, where they have this interest in politics. And so it sort of flows naturally that they'll go work for some think tank or for some NGO. But ultimately, what is the sort of raison d'etre for them is not moving the ball down the field, not actually making the world closer to what they would like it to be. It's more of just like a status thing and a money thing. And I mean, they really do get off to it. The idea of like living in DC and being, a part of what's going on, and they get to rub shoulders with people who they think are important, and this makes them feel better about themselves, and they go report back to Thanksgiving dinner. But they're just fundamentally like not true believers. They're not serious, and they don't have any sort of intellectual curiosity. If you say something that is deemed to be low status or taboo, they will look at you like you just said. I mean, that's probably actually the closest thing you could say to like pure evil is something that would be, more normal in our circles, just because it's so controversial in those circles. And so, yeah, I've never been around a setting like that where I've been impressed by the median attendee. Whereas at our event, I mean, I thought that I was probably like the 20th percentile there in terms of intelligence, which I think I'm a smart enough guy. I've been around, for a little while. I've been around to a lot of different organizations and events. And usually I can feel like I can, pretty much be, I guess, above average in that sort of environment. But I definitely felt like I was out of my depth. I've never been at an event where you had so many intelligent and successful people all gathered into one room, sort of endorsing the purpose of the event. So when I mentioned that in my speech, that was completely sincere. And I still am shocked that I was invited to speak at all, because, you've got guys giving these like brilliant historical dissertations. You had Radlib, deny genocide the night before that I went on. And so then I got up there and talked about electoral politics or whatever. But yeah, it's just like a totally different caliber of person, I think.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you said about college. That was very much my experience going to college. I did it because that's what you do. And especially for people in kind of our specific age demographic who went to school during COVID. I mean, that was a huge wake-up call, just from the sheer point of like, no one did anything and no one learned anything, and everyone still got degrees. And so it was a massive wake-up, because you're kind of told through media and other, it's no one ever tells it to you, right? But it's kind of a cultural meme that like, oh, this is the thing that smart, well-adjusted people do, right? If you're going to go somewhere, if you're going to be someone, this is the way you do it. And then you go to university, right? A good university, a good program. And you get there and you kind of look around and you're like, wait a minute, is this it? Like, is this what everyone is talking about? And especially over COVID, right? Which was the mother of all excuses to do no work. And I say this as someone who also did no work over COVID, right? At least as school is concerned. I think that it's incredibly, incredibly revealing, right? And so to take this back to a political dimension, I think one of the things that's been kind of fascinating to watch, and I'm not the biggest MAGA guy in the world, but to see the kind of traditional Republican institutions react to Donald Trump and kind of his following, because it revealed something very clear, which is that the Republican Party had no intention of winning, right? They were effectively a political organization for kind of second sons, right? The B team of politics, to make some money, right? To get some kind of social advancement. It was never a real political force. And, it's kind of fascinating to see the people who are attracted to those kind of career opportunities.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, what you're describing reminds me of the way that a lot of people from the dustbin of the conservative movement will write about how Bill Buckley treated them so that he could keep going to these, cocktail parties and rub shoulders with these kinds of people. And so that's actually something that was very awakening to me, is you kind of come up and you think that it is this really like ideological thing that you'll be canceled for on the right because you're saying something that these people are like starkly opposed to. But I found, not only in my study of the history of the movement, but also just my own experience, seeing that it is much less about the ideological differences, and it's much more about if you threaten their sense of status and sense of importance. And maybe like the left, which allows them to exist as this sort of de facto controlled opposition, does have that ideological problem with you. But in terms of the people on the right, actually, I think it tends to be much more that they just feel personally threatened by you, because you're going to say something that is serious, that wants to win, and that is going to make them obsolete. Or, you are saying things that they feel are threatening to their existence at all. Like you come into their publication and you say something like maybe, at the time, it would have been like, hey, I think maybe we shouldn't flood the country with immigrants. And they would say, no, you can't say that. And then they would fire you. I mean, this was happening even in the 2010s. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like going to college, it's not that we're anti-college. It's more that we're anti the democratization of it, because it doesn't actually, education is not actually an instrument to improve the human condition in the way that people think it is. I mean, it just dumbs down the value of the education, not only economically, but I would even say that that's in itself irrelevant. I mean, I think there is something to be said about education for that in itself, but even the quality of that has been completely watered down. And it's just like not even the same thing as when my parents were going to college, maybe even some of my older siblings.
And I think that speaks to a consistent problem we have in the conservative movement. And I don't just mean Republicans, right? I mean, you see this all the time in church figures, people involved in kind of Christian education, any of those kind of broadly right aligned institutions, is that for people of a certain age, their sort of prestige hierarchy, right, what they consider to be good and right action, is controlled by their enemies, right? And the problem is, if you let your enemies define for you, what your end state, what winning is, you have, oh, damn it, I forgot YouTube is not allowing me to say that word anymore. You're screwed. I'll edit that out. And you've seen this over and over again from generally just conservative types. Look, like, I'm not big into interdenominational Christian drama, but I have at least kind of realized that there's a giant problem going on in the Southern Baptist Convention, where effectively there's a group of people there trying to quote unquote modernize, right? Trying to have, female pastors, trying to soften on homosexuality. It's very unpopular with their base, but for these kind of professionally educated pastors, right? Maybe they didn't go to seminary, but they're intellectual types. They crave the approval of NPR, right? They don't want to go to a gross church where chuds go. They want to be prestigious. You actually saw a similar thing with certain Catholic priests in the Northeast, right? There's this whole kind of cast of people who remember when, if they were a priest in Princeton, that the entire faculty would be coming there for mass every Sunday. And they want that back. They want to have that kind of social prestige, but they can't do that and stay what they are. And so you have to ultimately make a decision, right? Which is, am I first and foremost, a rightist, a Christian, take your pick of identifiers, or am I someone who wants social prestige? And I think that when I look at younger people, people our age, for instance, one of the advantages is that many of those traditional paths towards prestige are just not open to us to begin with, right? You and I couldn't really work in the Biden admin, even if we really, really wanted to, right? We'd have to do some uncomfortable and perhaps compromising things to even get a chance at it. And I think that what you're seeing is, capable, competent people are basically being forced to find other options. And when you have, a section of the internet that has real discourse, right? Like, there are fun conversations being had here. You can throw ideas around. I think it's attractive to those type of people. But sorry, I've been talking for quite a long time, John. Back to you.
No, please. I think you're absolutely right about that. It's like, this is the only sphere where there is a true meritocracy. Like, it is actually just focused on talking about things that matter and ideas. And you have these like anon accounts who have ascended to being like, the cool kids or whatever. And even people who have gone in the more mainstream routes are either sharing these guys' content all the time or stealing it for themselves, the talking, whether like literally to the point of like plagiarizing, or you can tell that the seeds were planted in their minds, and then they take those ideas and they put them out onto their much larger platforms, which is fine. I mean, that's what should be happening. But it is interesting how in the right, as it exists online, and how everything else trickles down from that, everybody is sort of implicitly aware that what you want to be involved with is that sort of, what do they call it? This thing of ours, because that is where everything that's happening that is interesting is occurring. Whereas, these more mainstream type of institutions that might have larger audiences or more clout, so to speak, at different levels, they're not really as attractive to people, I don't think, as they would have been just 5-10 years ago.
So, John, one of the interesting things I've noticed in the past 3 years, and it seems like this has changed since the political debate recently, but it seems like there's energy leaking out of the system, right? Politics isn't the main thing in the same way it was really through the Trump era. Obviously, you can see this in the fact that there's very little enthusiasm for Biden, right? He's not doing particularly well in the polls, his mental issues aside. And so I'm curious, do you see any segment of politics where there is energy? And do you think the DNC can recapture that kind of enthusiasm before November?
Not for the Biden campaign, and certainly not for like Kamala Harris. I mean, I think that things will sort of amp up, like as much as we're, Chud Jack raging because it's not 2016 again. Like when you start to get closer to election day, I mean, it's going to start to get more exciting. It'll be more fun, I think. But in terms of just the right, I think that our energy and focus has become much less about, like you said, politics, and it's sort of compartmentalized itself into different spheres. Like, for example, the health and wellness sphere is something that is a breeding ground for becoming right wing, and increasingly too, because of guys like Alaric. Martial arts are becoming much more explicitly right wing in the sense that if you are getting involved at like an MMA gym, the types of conversations you're going to be hearing about are going to be less focused on more day-to-day pleasantries and much more focused on, even if it's just, intro to right-wing thought, like, frick Biden. We love Trump. We're going to send them all back, things like that. And so maybe it's not so focused on just purely electoral politics or things of that nature. But I think that people are allowing it to become a larger part of hobbies of theirs as they start to understand that a lot of what you do is downstream from your spirit and your view of the world. And I think that when you meet guys that are sort of experiencing a similar reaction to the way that things have been going in the country or in the world or in their communities, those types of networks are just starting to kind of sprout naturally without needing to really even be guided by some sort of central force.
I'll put it this way. I think there are 2 people at my jiu-jitsu gym who have an SBLC page devoted to them. So you're entirely right there.
Let's go. Okay, you know what? On that note, by the way, since I saw the profile picture, I disagree. You threatened me. You said that you're gonna kick the shit out of me. I don't know, man. Now that I'm remembering what you look like, I respect the martial arts background, but I don't know, man. If maybe that's the main event next year at OGC. I'm gonna come out to the Bret Hart theme song, and we'll do a little wrestling, do a little boxing or something. We'll see what happens.
Well, I'll put it this way. I was actually supposed to fight someone at that conference, and he chickened out. He never showed up. So you know what? I feel like I've made that promise already. I'll do it. I'll fight John Doyle next year.
Yeah, well, I wish that were a more normal occurrence on the right, because I'm not, the toughest guy in the world or anything, but I don't understand the concept of like internet drama. Like when I would get into these conflicts with leftists, or now like the Groypers come after, that's not something that computes to me. Like, let's just figure it out, fight it out, shake hands after, and move on. Like that's a timeless currency for resolving conflict between men. But now I don't know if it's because guys are just like all pussies now, or because they never got hit in the face, or they didn't have an involvement in sports now. But the idea of even proposing violence as like a means to solve just a dispute between 2 guys is either met with like, no, cringe. Oh, you're so mad. Oh, what are you, a fed or something like that? Like it doesn't even register with these people, especially younger guys, as like a legitimate method by which to resolve some sort of conflict.
Well, I'll put it this way. I think here's what we should do. We should set up a date for a fight and figure out an issue to be mad about afterwards. We'll backfill the drama. We'll come up with something by the time this podcast comes out.
Yeah, no, that's real. We'll have like a WWE style promo. Like, okay, you guys are going to fight. That's happening. But now we have to build it up. We have to release the promo, and we have to sell the shirts and everything. Yeah, that's very real.
Well, this is also nice because this gets me out of the previous influencer I agreed to fight, who is John Slaughter, who would 100% kick my ass. And so this gives me a convenient excuse.
Wait, so he was there, though. He was at the bar with us.
Yeah, he's the guy with tattoos.
So he just didn't want to fight you or something?
No. Oh, sorry. Confusing. I was supposed to fight a Mexican dude who's a Vedic pagan And I said, if I beat you in a fight, you have to come to church, which I thought was funny. He said yes, and then chickened out at the last moment. So, I mean, really, sorry, Pajit Cells. I think we know whose religion is better. But anyway, yeah, no, that was a whole nother thing that came up. But yeah, John Slaughter was like, well, if you don't fight him, you should fight me. And I said yes, but in the back of my mind, it's like, I really don't want to fight John Slaughter because he could totally kick my ass. And thankfully, it never happened. Just being 100%.
Yeah, that guy
honest.
is because he's like ex-Marine or something.
Oh yeah, 100%. Right? Like 15 years kickboxing. He would turn me into a fine mist.
Yeah,
but it would be funny. So
the last like fight I got to on the E-Right was, do you remember Kai Clips?
Is that Kai Sanat?
No.
I'm sorry. No. I'm so out of date on like Zoom.
No, he's
I don't know.
He was making TikToks back in like during COVID, and then he was involved with AF for a while. But this guy was like a legitimate bodybuilder. I mean, this guy was like deadlifting 405 for reps. This guy was like absolutely built, and he was at this like summer get together that we do, and he and I wrestled, and I choked him out two rounds in a row, and with no fighting experience at that time, just simply, you know, watching WWE growing up, things like that.
Just hit him with a stone cold stunner while you're at it.
Dude, literally, like everyone was like cheering against me at my event, and I was like, "What the heck? Okay, fine. I'm gonna heck this guy off." And yeah, we choked him out twice. So don't nap, but don't sleep. You might have a rude awakening in your future.
Well, fair enough. I think that we'll set up a fight. It'll be fun. So
yeah.
Back to, and this is something that I think is kind of an interesting development, right? Among people our age, is that, and obviously this is kind of a byproduct of social media, right? You can read about this even in you know, more kind of regime friendly places, right? Like The Economist and Business Insider, right? And you hear kind of common refrains, you know, like Gen Z is conscious consumers. You know, they love to sort of bundle together a selection of kind of like brands and fashion items, you know, music or whatever, to paint themselves as a certain type of person. And in fact, you actually see a little bit of this even on the right, like pit vipers, zins, you know, pick your poison. And one of the things that's particularly apparent in that is that leftism is kind of woman coded. Like women are libtards, you know, men are, broadly speaking, more on the right. You know, you've seen this even with kind of the rise of figures like Andrew Tate, you know, people like that. But do you think that kind of like sexual gap between the two sides of politics, do you think that trend is going to continue in the future, or do you think that's something that can be solved?
It's probably going to have to continue, just because like women are just getting more uppity in our spheres, and it is very annoying. And I don't think that, and I've said this before, and people don't believe that it's true, but I really think it is, that you actually suffer more consequences speaking honestly about the differences between men and women than you do speaking about like Jews or, you know, things that are regarded to be more taboo. Like you can say things that are funny, like, oh, I'm pulling on your hair, haha, 19th Amendment, or you can make jokes about Jews or blacks or whomever. But if you actually like have an honest conversation about the differences between male and female temperament, not just like, oh, women tend to be more emotional and men tend to be more logical, ha ha ha, like things that would actually maybe bar them from the positions that they occupy within our spheres. But then it's like, you know, they're just going to continue to do that because there's always going to be that like low caste of simps who's willing to give them that attention. But I don't like to do the gender wars thing because I am sexist enough to know that it's not going to get us anywhere. So I don't think that there's ever going to be a solution to it, especially with how democratized communication is now, where anybody can make a Twitter account and say something and epic ratio get owned, BTFO'd. So I tend to just avoid it because I don't see a scenario where it could ever be productive. But I don't think that independently of my avoidance of that, it's going to heal. I think it's just going to continue to get worse and worse, especially because women are just going to continue to get more miserable. And men are going to just continue to be, you know, incel virgins who aren't communicating with women and who are looking for some sort of reason to, like whether it's the whatever podcast, which is just like torture porn for incels so they can watch like women get epically owned by guys like Andrew Tate, or, you know, any sort of content that is allowing for women to just say ridiculous things into a microphone to get clicks, whether it's, oh yeah, you know, I cheated on my husband during our honeymoon and I don't regret it. Or, you know, is that woman recently talking about, I think, like sleeping with Matt Stafford's roommate in college to piss him off, like just stupid stuff like that is just going viral all of the time because people almost like want to believe that it's so over between, you know, male-female relations, romantic or otherwise. And so I think that incentive is too strong, and I think the availability is also too strong for that to show any sign of getting better anytime soon.
So what do you think the reason is that this sort of like it's so over, you know, don't try, just give up reasoning is so popular? Because one of the things that I think about is that it seems like oftentimes there's sort of a superiority attached to that, which is like, oh, you're still trying. Well, guess what?
Yes.
I already know we're all screwed. So I was, you know, ahead of the curve, and you're a retard for still trying or still caring. I mean, that's some of it. Do you think there's anything else kind of motivating that type of behavior?
I think that is probably the primary part, because that's like the problem of our generation is we're so insincere, and anybody who tries to do anything is like cringe. And we're very deconstructive. Like, it's a lot easier to sit back and look at somebody else trying to do something and deconstruct it and say, this is why it's not going to work. This is blah, blah, blah. And then if and when it fails, then you get to say, I told you so. But you're proposing no alternative. I mean, you're just sitting there and it's just like over for you. And I think that is what is so attractive about it too, is, you know, you don't tend to see people who are otherwise successful in life speaking about our problems this sort of way. It tends to attract very antisocial losers, which I'm not saying that to like disparage. I mean, I don't know your individual circumstance, but what I will say is that being black-pilled is a cope. Like, there's always something that you can do to change your immediate circumstance and to work towards building a better long-term circumstance for you and for your family and for your community. And to say that it's just over and there's nothing, I mean, that's just like retarded, and it's a cope. And it's just, and you know that because too, them being like retarded, lazy, depressed losers manifests in other areas of their life. Like, everything is going poorly for these people. It's not like you have somebody who's very successful and then on the side they log on and they're just like, no, it's actually just like so over. Like, these people are just themselves losers, and they want to like just throw arrows at everybody else trying to do something because misery loves company, and they would rather everybody just be alone and online and coping and just, you know, seething all day so that they don't have to do it by themselves.
I think that there's another lesson. I was talking to a friend of mine, right? I won't say who it was, but he's been on the right for a long time, right? And one of the things he was talking about is that if you don't have anything else, right? If all you have is politics, you tend to just kind of purity spiral into oblivion, right? And you particularly see this in the kind of like Wignat sphere, you know, which is like, look, like that's not my politics, right? I don't really associate with those people. But there's this kind of like, well, I'm purer than you. I'm more right-wing than you. You know, like, I have taken everything you believe to the ultimate extreme, and you're a pussy because you're not man enough to do what I've done. But the problem is it's the same thing with libertarians, right? Where it's like, you're okay, fine, you're consistent, but like, what are you doing? You know, like, what is your life like? What are the kind of fruits of this behavior? And, you know, I don't mean to speak about everyone, but very often those people don't seem to be living particularly good lives. And I'm not saying this in the same way that kind of leftoids on Twitter will say like, oh, I bet you're posting from your mom's basement. Like, no, not at all. That's dumb. But to say like, I think it's worthwhile to actually look at someone, look at their beliefs, and draw some kind of conclusion based off of that relationship, right? And you see this every time one of our guys gets doxxed, right? You know, Raw Egg Nationalist gets doxxed, and it's like, oh, the normal guy. Lomez gets doxxed. He's a good-looking guy, college athlete, loving family, running a successful business, right? Like, okay, I don't agree with those guys on everything, but at the very least, you know, there seems to be something working there. And yeah, I just have very, very little patience for this kind of purity spiraling that seems almost kind of endemic to right-wing circles.
Of course, because that is what they do. You know, they don't have publishing companies. They're not bringing back these texts that were inaccessible They don't do anything except sometimes they can make the shapes on your phone screen appear in a way that might be offensive to you. Like, that is what they do. The extent of their existence in politics is just being there to always be like, you know, poking at you and doing, but they do nothing else. They have nothing else to show for themselves besides that. And if honestly, like, the last 6 years I've been doing this, the worst part of it has been the way that it has made me view certain components of mankind. Like, that type of person has become so illuminated in a way that maybe I think is it makes me have to pray for patience and for charity, because I have grown so tired of those types of people, because it's exactly like that. And it's any area on the internet, you have those types of people, any fandom, literally anywhere you go on the internet, you will have people like that who just want a purity spiral and who just want to be negative and deconstructive, but they don't do anything. And I don't know anybody who is being effective that also has that sort of behavioral pattern. You know, if they're criticizing something, it tends to be more good faith and constructive, and you can accept that correction and move on, or you can say that you disagree with it. But there is something to be said about punching up. I mean, that's what tends to happen. You rarely see people who are successful who are then trying to sort of, you know, channel that bitterness into other people, unless you have some sort of personal beef with them. Like, I know Donald Trump would do that all the time with like Rosie O'Donnell or whomever, but it just tends to be something I think that is much more indicative of this sort of like miserable bitterness, and you're just kind of lashing out at any target you can find.
I think that one of the things that is kind of a problem that does have to be solved within the right, and actually I think it's somewhat relevant to the woman question, which we talked about earlier, which is effectively what is fair game for conflict, right? Like, what is kind of a open and fair? Because I think one of the reasons that, and I have not been following it particularly closely, largely because I don't care, but I have become aware of this just because it has been kind of a giant, you know, firestorm for the last couple months, is that there are kind of female people on the right who sort of have a Mott and Bailey approach to dialogue, right? Where on one hand, you know, they want to be considered kind of serious people, right? So they will put forth ideas and then want to kind of retreat back to, well, I'm just a woman and you have to treat me nicely when it comes to those ideas being criticized. Now, on the other hand, right, there's the question of like, well, okay, like legitimately, like what are the lines that are considered unacceptable, right? I think one of the widely assumed ones is doxing, right? You don't dox. If you dox someone, you're out. But on the other hand, right, there's this kind of gray area of like, well, okay, is this productive? Is this kind of pushing the movement forward, or is this just kind of creating drama? And I think that that's something that's going to be very difficult to manage, because you mentioned this kind of like fandom. And I think that, and I won't mention specifics here, but there's this kind of problem of fandom and kind of entertainment mixing in with politics. And don't get me wrong, like you said, like the advantage of having ideas that the regime doesn't like is that if you are popular, it is literally just because you're funny, you're entertaining, you have interesting ideas, right? You're getting no boost from the symptom, or the system rather. So I want to, you know, hold that, right? You need to be what, you know, people would call winsome, right? People need to like you, but also, you know, merely kind of accumulating clicks, merely kind of growing a fandom is not really the way to fix any of these problems. And so I'm curious, you know, I've thrown a lot at you there. You know, what do you think is the way that we kind of get out of this kind of like drama trap? And what do you think are kind of the respectable rules where we can still have discourse, we can still have contention without it turning into kind of a, you know, a bi-weekly, you know, just kind of like flame war of and accomplishing absolutely nothing? Sorry, it's a very rambly question, but there should be something you can grab onto in there.
Yeah, I think that you just evaluate people by how their behavior is affecting the sphere and the people who look to them for influence. Like, you know, for example, when that one particular group of people declared war on me a couple of years ago, it was because I said in a Twitter space something like their organization, because people were saying, oh, you know, these people might be feds. And I said something like, the behavior, whether they are feds, is actually irrelevant, because the behavior of the organization wouldn't be significantly different if it were controlled by them. Because you've got people talking about things that are extremely unoptical. You've got people that are under FBI investigation for J6. You should not be wrangling young men to associate with these people in public, much less recording their names, taking photographs, etc. And so I've been dealing with the fallout from that for, the last 2 years or so. But even recently on Twitter, I said something similar, because they did this event in Detroit, and, it got shut down, and they weren't going to issue refunds. But then they said that anybody who asks for one is a traitor. And so I said something like, okay, yeah, so you're doing this event. Everyone has to show up to talk about waging war on Jewish people, about loving Adolf Hitler. So you've got all these young men who are otherwise maybe good on the issues, who are now going to put themselves into positions where there are journalists standing by to take pictures of them, which I pointed out. They said, no, that's not true. Then some libtard journalist was like, actually, I was there the whole time. So I retweeted that to say, yes, look, this is a journalist who says, I was there at the event taking photos of all these young men. I've got all their pictures. So I retweet that as proof. And then the line becomes, well, John Doyle is endorsing Antifa doxing tactics, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, these same people were also sharing the doxes of Anons that had just come out. So I don't care about people's personal beliefs or behavior or really anything other than how it is affecting what we are trying to do as the right, and if you are jeopardizing the lives of young men. And insofar as your behavior is polluting that or is taking that off track, then yeah, you should basically get offline and go do something else, because that's not productive, that's not positive. And we should be able to talk about these things without being women or faggots about it, without resorting to like this petty e-drama and the kinds of stuff that you're seeing now. But again, that is the inevitable result of the sort of influencer versus the person who just talks about things. Because if the point is to just raise the public profile of, your favorite live streamer, then it's going to become a fundamentally less serious operation than if it is to just, move the ball down the field politically or rhetorically. And that's exactly what you've seen. So, yeah, I think that we need to gatekeep people who are unserious.
So one of the other ideas you see, particularly on the radical right, is the idea that, electoral politics is lost ground, right? There's nothing to be done there. I'm curious, what's your opinion on that idea?
It's just like not true. I mean, like, for example, I'm a big fan of the idea of our guys getting involved in all levels of politics so that we can actually use political power to our advantage. I have been told by autistic brown teenagers that this doesn't actually work. And what we need to do is instead start a movement of people. And this is how things work, because this is what I read in my history textbook when I was in school, about MLK and about all of these great leaders of people and things like that, which is a fundamentally leftist idea. It's democracy. You're thinking that the people can change something by themselves simply by coming out in public and, showing the power that we're not afraid of them or whatever. And so I think that's ridiculous. I mean, obviously, we do have to sort of deal with democracy as a system in this country, but you can also get involved in politics and move things in a way that would be much more positive for us. Look at President Trump, for example. I mean, President Trump, I had to hear about this from the TRS people. I have to hear about it now from AFAGs about how he's Zion Don, didn't do anything for us. He's an Israeli shill. And it's just an incompatible model for political change, because this is the guy who was taking $20 million from the Adelsons in 2016, but he still managed to somehow have legal immigration. He started no new conflicts in the Middle East. He de-escalated conflicts in the Middle East. And supposedly, I mean, you're supposed to get in there and be like George Bush or Barack Obama and be bombing all of these people, but he didn't. I mean, there was a great article actually recently. I forgot who wrote it. I think it was in Jacques or something on Substack, summarizing Trump's success in Middle Eastern foreign policy. But like, we're supposed to believe that this is something that is impossible if you are, involved in mainstream electoral politics because of ethnic lobbies or whatever. And this because you bought the Israel lobby on Amazon for $12, which is supposedly like such an edgy and controversial book. And you get 2 days shipping on Jeff Bezos' platform or something. But yeah, it's just like an ahistorical, incompatible view of how politics actually works. I mean, there is no political solution. By definition, the solution is going to be political. I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, you're not going to have some sort of Mad Max scenario. And if you did, we'd all get killed by cartels anyway, unless you're out like way in the, the far northwest area. And even then, I mean, what's to stop them from coming to kill you there? That's what they've done on Ruby Ridge. Why would they not just like replicate that model? So it's similar to the insincerity into the black pill cope. It's a way of saying I'm edgier than you because I want the collapse. You want to get involved in politics because you fear the collapse. Grr, I am super smart and super tough. And it's like, you're just like 95 IQ. Like that is what you are.
Yeah. Going out to your point about edgier than you see a similar thing with certain, authors or thinkers, right? Or it's like, oh, and it's not expressed exactly like this, but it's like, oh, you care about Thomas Carlyle. That's so 2021. He's old hat. Because the kind of attention cycle of the internet is so brief. These thinkers, these books get kind of turned into memes, right, by people who've never read them, and so they condense very complicated book into like 3 basic ideas that you can put in impact font on a Wojak meme, and then once that's kind of boring, the meme has died. All of those ideas are assumed to also be old and boring. Like, oh, we don't care about Evola anymore. We found some new esoteric French racist from the 18th century. It's this kind of like ever delving deeper. And don't get me wrong, that's fun and that's interesting. Those thinkers have things to bring to the table. But if you're not a researcher, right, if this isn't what you do, if you're not the type of person who is able to kind of take ideas and disseminate them, which is a really important thing, right? I don't have the time to read a lot of these books, and I don't have the time to sift through to find them in the first place. And so I appreciate that service. But again, from many of the consumers, you see this like, oh, that's old hat, that's boring. I need something newer. I need something edgier, so I can be the most hardcore, the most extreme. And, in all of this, I'm not trying to say, extremity in and of itself is a problem. Right. You and I probably have views on abortion that, according to the US government, are quite extreme. Right. I'll just throw that out there. But nonetheless, right, extremity for its own sake, it's somewhat similar to what you saw with kind of the Dime Square crowd. Right. These allegedly, this far right, kind of social movement in New York, all these kind of like wannabe hipsters. And it's like, well, OK, that was 2 years ago. Where are all those people now? Well, it seems like at the very least, they were motivated by that desire to be edgy and novel. And when that wore off, they've moved on to something else, right? And supposedly these important eternal ideas have been cast away for kind of a new, something new and convenient.
But yeah, I think that's, it's very easy to get attention, and it's much easier to get negative attention. And I think that there's sort of 2 sides of the red pill, so to speak. I mean, the one side might be the ideas, but the other side, which is maybe even more important, is how do we actually like implement these ideas? But that requires you to be forward thinking and prudent and productive. And unfortunately, when you just want to doom scroll and you want to refresh and get the new take and the new content or whatever, this is not conducive to that sort of mindset. And that's, again, the negative of the inflection point between what we talk about and it just being purely for entertainment value. That is certainly one of the downsides of that.
Well, and I think it's why IRL events, like the ones we went to, and there are many others, are so important, right? Because ultimately, the internet is a tool, right? The internet is not an end. The goal of this thing that you and I do is not to win the internet, right? It's not to get the largest audience, to make the most money. It's actually accomplished something in the real world. And at a certain point, and it may not be now, it may not be for years, there needs to be a jump from online to real world, right? Twitter is powerful, right? We've all seen that, but fundamentally it is not real. It's like that old Tyler, the Creator tweet where he's like, I don't understand how you can be cyberbullied. Literally just close your eyes.
Yes.
Like there's some truth to that.
Yeah, that is absolutely real. I've never actually gone to an event sort of like OGC's. I'm always very sort of averse to the idea of IRL events, only because in the way that they usually exist with like college organizations, for example, I remember like just seeing these flyers that would come out and they would have all these speakers, and then you'd go to the event and everyone's going to give a speech, and then we're going to take pictures and we're going to post the pictures, and this is what doing something looks like. And it's like, meanwhile, you know, like the event is happening in Arizona, and you drive, you know, a few hundred miles south, and the border's wide open and people are flooding in, but because like some guy who, you know, does hits on Fox News gave a speech, like this is what doing something is like. So I hate that kind of stuff. However, when you can actually do an event where it is exclusive and you are only bringing together people who could actually be the stock of person to do something productive, once that sort of sprouts into something more than just getting together for a weekend or what have you, that is something I think is very positive, and it is requisite to what the future is going to have to look like. Because you're right. I mean, Twitter is not real life. It is just in your phone. It's not real. And what is real is getting together with like-minded guys and figuring out something that is more tangible, I think, for the future. And that event, I mean, really, I can't speak highly enough about it. Seeing the type of people that were able to attend and be attracted to that sort of thing, I mean, it was truly something I've never been a part of before. And I'm looking forward to seeing that type of event become more prominent and more popular as things sort of continue the trajectory that they're on.
I think that the thing that kind of gives me short to medium term hope, and I don't mean that sounds a little bit corny, but you know what I mean, right? The thing that I see as a positive development is the kind of behind the scenes social network that has been building up. I was talking to Dave, the distributist, recently in a Twitter space, and he was talking about how he tried to start a sort of similar fraternal organization in 2018, and it didn't work. And what he said is basically people weren't ready for it, right? It was a good idea, but people didn't need alternative social structures, right? And don't get me wrong, you know, 2018 was not exactly, you know, like the perfect state. You know, things have been better. Hopefully things will be better again. But there was kind of a baseline level of functioning, at least in enough things that most people were like, all right, thanks, but no thanks, right? I don't need that. And so one of the things that I notice, and in talking to a lot of South Africans, right, is that they live in a failed state. And so many people are unwilling to actually do anything up until the point where it actually starts very negatively affecting their lives, right? Where it actually, I need to do this or else. And so to look around and see what are very likely early adopters, right? People who are ahead of the curve, basically saying like, oh, okay, like we need to form our own alternative institutions, right? A mutual aid society, that sounds like a good idea. You know, building up a kind of fraternal organization in my city, in my state, you know, where I can go to people. And I mean, they're already working, right? Like there's a guy at that conference, I won't say who needed a job. Another guy in the group, you know, executive of the company, gets him a job. Now he's doing great. Right. And being able to basically go around the kind of traditional, you know, the traditional, organizations, the traditional institutions that we spent the first 20 minutes complaining about, I think is really exciting because, you know, look, you've been in conservative spheres as long as I've had. People have been talking about parallelism. People have been talking about, well, we'll build our own for a really long time. And it's largely come to nothing. And so my point in this is not saying, all right, we did it. We're in based world. We've got everything we've needed. But you know, when I was talking earlier about political energy, there is at least some energy here, and there's not a lot of energy in other places. And so when you look at these kind of confluence of factors of like, okay, there are capable people here who have been pushed out by the regime. You know, there's kind of there's something growing, you know, there are things being built. I mean, to be honest, I think it's the most exciting place on the internet to be.
Yeah, there needs to be, like you said, a sort of incentive to jump to the lily pad, because early adopters might do it because it's the right thing to do, but there is sort of a bell curve, so to speak, for how close people have to get to the fire before they kind of want to make that jump, how much their circumstances have to be affected by what we're seeing happen to our country before they're willing to actually do something about it. And insofar as we can build something that is promising and that is available to them for when they're ready to make that jump, that will ultimately be much more positive than, like you said, you know, every other alternative that we've heard proposed for the last 5 or 7 years about, you know, building a parallel Amazon.com or something. I mean, that's not real. That's not like an actual thing. But being able to establish some sort of patronage network where some guy is no longer able to work and you're able to get him a job, and he likewise is able to provide value to you. I mean, that is something that is very promising. It's very real.
So that's one thing that I think is relevant. And we mentioned doxing earlier. Do you think that doxing has lost its sting, or do you think it's becoming less effective over time?
Yeah, I think it's certainly becoming less effective. And honestly, if anything, the worst part about it is that it sort of takes away from the allure of some of these accounts that have made themselves into like folk heroes on the e-right, you know, insofar as that can exist. But professionally, I mean, the consequences just don't really exist. Personally, I mean, again, the big thing you have to do, I think, to avoid personal consequences is just simply don't spurg out. Like, I don't obviously endorse what's happening right now to the gentleman who's having pizza delivered to his house or whatever. But unfortunately, he's giving these people exactly the reaction that they want. And so that will only continue. And the same thing happens, you know, if you get doxxed and you spurg out, you freak out, and it's just like going to continue piling on or whatever. But when you get doxxed and it turns out that you're just like a normal, well-adjusted guy who's successful and handsome and cool, well, I mean, what are they really going to do at that point? I mean, how can they come after you if everything that you're doing already is going so well for you, and then they just don't have that sort of clout anymore? I mean, people are so, not to say that like people are waking up or whatever, but the incentive to target people for having incorrect opinions is just not the same as it used to be even like 3 years ago.
Yeah, this is something that, you know, my buddy Thomas talks about all the time, which is like being right wing has been massively normalized. Obviously not in an ultimate sense, right? You know, you and I can't have these type of conversations, you know, in a public university, for example. But nonetheless, you know, he's talking about a time even within, you know, relatively recent memory, right? Like the late 90s, where if you had a newsletter with 100 people on it, you were like the biggest fish in the pond. You were huge. And now, you know, 100 listeners is nothing, right? I haven't written an article on Substack since February. And I think I have like over 1,000 people subscribed to it for literally no reason. I don't post anything there, right? And so my point is to say, like, that's a very, very easy thing to do now. And obviously, look, like people who subscribe to an e-newsletter, right, that does not translate into political power. But I think that, you know, the one advantage of having true ideas is that as things get more and more absurd, right, as the kind of ruling ideology becomes more on its face, just awful and ugly, that you, by comparison, look much better. And so, like, look, like the through line through, I think, all the things that we've been talking about is that we are in fact not over. We're so back.
Yeah, it's an excellent bow to tie at the end of this discussion. I think that I concur with your analysis.
So anyway, man, if people want to find more of your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Dude, I'm telling you, I have been posting consistent content on YouTube pretty much like 6 days a week for the last few years. But MI6 and Mossad and the CIA are so threatened by the epic red pills that I am dispersing to the masses that they have deleted all of it. So apparently I'm in a similar situation to yourself where I'm not making that much content, but there are still people who are standing back and standing by until the release of it. So if you are looking to join that wonderful assembly of people, you can go to youtube.com/John Doyle, or you can follow me on Twitter at Comrade Doyle to see some of that if you are so inclined.
Well, great, man. This is kind of funny, but I actually, when I went to pick you up at the airport, I did not realize that you were a notable conservative influencer. I was like, all right, cool. I guess we're going to pick some guy up at the airport. So it was very pleasant to spend a couple hours in the car together. I really enjoyed it. And again, man, thanks for coming on to my show. It was a good time.
Of course. Yeah, I'll be honest. I'm disappointed that we didn't get into the real conversation. I sort of was so intoxicated by that I thought maybe we would get to revisit it during this podcast. But, optics, right? Optics.
Put it this way. There are multiple things you could be referring to, and I'm afraid of all of them. In my defense, I was on 2 hours of sleep, and I'm just kind of like that. So I really have no defense at all.
Well, yeah, I remember during the Q&A, I think I mentioned that as well, and the whole room erupted. They were so excited about Miss Shapiro that, maybe there's something we can do there in the future. I don't know. Did they shut it down?
Oh, that's embarrassing. I meant to mute your mic because you were talking about my shall we say, unorthodox opinions about Abby Shapiro.
It's perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. If anything, honestly, the way the dynamics are changing on the right, I'm happy you're a confirmed heterosexual.
That's true. I seem to be in rare company. I'll put it that way. Anyway, if you want to subscribe to the Jay Burden Show, you could do so on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Please leave a review, not because I particularly care about them, but because the reviews you have led are very funny and they make me laugh. So I appreciate that. Check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD is very, very good at what he does, and I can't recommend his product enough. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.